Brother Wes's title of his discourse is The Days Are at Hand. The days are at hand. Brother Wes.
Okay, thank you, Brother Ed, and thank you, Brother.
Wes, can't hear you.
Okay, we'll try that one, Brother Ed.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, can you hear me? Am I coming through okay, Brother Ed?
Yeah, and you
Okay.
look good.
Great. Okay, thank you. And once again, we'll say good afternoon, brethren, and what a delight and a privilege it is for us to be with you. And we are glad to bring with us and to you the love from the Connellsville Ecclesia, with whom we have been privileged to meet for many years. We very much appreciate the opportunity and the privilege that the Lord has given us through the kind invitation of the Central Ohio Brethren for this privilege today. The Central Ohio Brethren have asked us to address that portion of Ezekiel 12:23 that reads, "Tell them, therefore, the days are at hand." Now, this phrase, or something nearly identical to it, should sound very familiar to us, because in Revelation 22:10, we read, "And he," referencing here the seventh angel, "saith unto me, John," or the John class, "Seal not the sayings of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand." Also in volume 2, page 363, very much toward the end of the book, we read the following, and we quote, "The time is at hand for the establishment of the Redeemer's kingdom." This is the concurrent testimony of the foregoing chapters. Nothing intervenes. The establishment of the long-promised kingdom of Messiah is therefore the great event just before us. Not only so, but its establishment is now in progress. Now, if we look at just the early part of the establishment of Messiah's kingdom, we believe that we can see three aspects. Again, we're just looking at the early part of the establishment of Messiah's kingdom. We're not looking at the whole picture. The first aspect of the establishment of Messiah's kingdom is the gradual elimination of Satan's systemic empire. This is going to include the annihilation of all institutions that Satan has built, organizations, ideologies, customs, and so on. Satan's institutions are broad and deep, and they include social injustice, racism, illiteracy, oppression, concealment, deception, and a whole long list beyond that. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, Peter says that Satan's heavens and Satan's earth are destroyed first in the fire in the day of judgment. And of course, we all recognize as the day of judgment, the Lord's day, is 1,000 of our years. The second aspect of establishing Messiah's kingdom is the displacing of Satan's institutions with kingdom principles, principles of truth and righteousness. Christ's principles, as we all know, are quite the opposite of Satan's. Christ's principles include things like accountability, literacy, liberty, revealment. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 29, Jesus said that he would return. He would enter Satan's house, and he would spoil both his house and also his goods. This simultaneous work of gradually displacing Satan's institutions with Christ's principles began in 1874 with our Lord's return. Jesus said in Matthew 24:27 that his influence on the entire world upon his return would be done gradually. It would be done, he said, like a sunrise rising from the east and traveling toward the west. And so since 1874, he has been doing both. He has been doing both a demolition work and he has been doing a construction work. Messiah's kingdom starts small with Jesus' silent return, and it gradually grows until it reshapes the entire world. The third aspect, the third early aspect of the establishment of Messiah's kingdom is the completion of the church. Jesus said in Luke chapter 19 that upon his return, he would promptly reckon with his saints, with his servants, and give each of them their reward. The announcement in the late 1800s and early 1900s that the Lord had returned had a profound impact on the Lord's people. They thought surely the returned Lord would fulfill his promise and reward his saints promptly after his arrival. It's this third early aspect of the establishment of Messiah's kingdom, that is to say, the glorification of the church, that the Central Ohio Brethren have asked us to focus on. We'd like to paraphrase their questions. First of all, exactly what did the true church expect in 1914, as well as shortly thereafter? Secondly, how has the true church reacted to the failed expectations beginning in 1914 and continuing through 2020? Third, what should be the true church's reaction to the fact that a century later, the entire church is still, as near as we can tell, not glorified? We believe that the best way we can start to address these questions is by first overviewing a century of Bible student teachings and Bible student history. So we're going to start today's lesson a century ago, approximately a little over a century ago. Now, actually, to more fully appreciate Bible student expectations about 1914, we really need to start a few years before 1914. We start with Bible student teachings and expectations based on those teachings beginning in the late 1800s. In volume 3, page 133, which was published in 1890, we read the following: "And now he has come, the Lord is indeed present, and the time is at hand for the setting up of his kingdom and the exaltation and glorification of his faithful bride." End of quote. It's important to recognize that Bible students had more than one set of expectations about 1914. Identifying Bible student expectations about 1914 depends on exactly what date we are identifying those expectations. Bible students' expectations went through, as near as we can tell, 3 significantly different phases between 1874 and 1916. We want to take a look at each of these 3 phases because we believe that looking at this history is going to help us understand how we get to where we are today. The first phase of Bible students' expectations after 1874, relative to the glorification of the entire church, extended up through about 1904. The expectation was that the complete glorification of the body of Christ would occur about 1912. An early edition of volume 3 on page 228, that's 228, volume 3, we read, and we quote, again, this is an early edition of volume 3, and we quote, that the deliverance of the saints must take place sometime before 1914 is manifest. Now, this view that the saints would all be glorified before 1914 was fine-tuned, we might say, in reprint 3389. This is an article that was published in July of 1904, and we quote, "Our previous expectation was that the anarchistic period, which would last some 3 or 4 years, and in our mental calculations of the opportunities for harvest work, we naturally cut off those years, and the time thus appeared shorter to us." End of quote. Now, if we take a look at this entire article in 3389, it reveals the following reasoning relative to the period prior to 1904. The lease of the Gentile power, or the lease of power to the Gentiles, the kingdom of this world, would end in late 1914. That is to say, before 1915, the lease of power would terminate. Armageddon was the vehicle that would operate to fully evict the Gentile kingdom and kingdoms by the end of the Gentile times. Armageddon, according to reprint 3389, was expected to last a very short period of time, about 3 to 4 years. And the Christ would not go through the Armageddon trouble. That was the expectation. So if Armageddon lasted 3 or 4 years and had to be finished before 1915, and Christ would not go through it, that meant that the Christ had to be all glorified by about 1912. Again, that's about 3 to 4 years before 1915. This timeline would enable the Christ to be completed, to leave 3 or 4 remaining years to finish the Armageddon work, and to have Christ's administration fully in place and governing the world in peace from 1915 onward. So to briefly recap, up to 1904, the true church expected to be all beyond the veil by about 1912. The second phase of Bible students' expectations about church glorification is that it would be finished at the end of the Gentile times. Bible students held this view from about 1904 to 1914. Again, reprint 3389 gives us this view. Again, it was giving us the prior view, and it was giving us the view from 19 forward, looking forward. Reprint 3389, and we quote, "Our 40 years harvest ending in October 1914 should not be expected to include the awful period of anarchy which the scriptures point out to be the fate of Christendom," end of quote. So in this second view about complete church glorification, Bible students expected that the gospel harvest would include 40 full years ending in 1914. But unlike the view held in 1904 up to 1904, the Armageddon phase, the anarchy phase, the vehicle that would eliminate Satan's empire entirely, would not precede 1914, but rather would promptly follow 1914. So under this view, the glorification of the church would be finished in late 1914, at which point the complete Christ would quickly destroy Satan's empire. Now, right up to the end of 1914, the true church expected to be all glorified before 1915. In reprint 5374, that's 5374, published on January 1, 1914, which I believe is also printed on your program, we read the following quote: "We shall be as glad as anyone if we shall all experience our change from earthly to spirit conditions before 1915, and this is our expectation." End of quote. The article goes on to caution that all the body members may not be on the other side of the veil by 1915. However, the clear expectation is that every church member would be beyond the veil before 1915. The Bible student community held these two views of the glorification of the entire church, either full glorification in 1912 or full glorification by 1914. The Bible student community held one or other of these two views for over 35 years. These were the Bible students' expectations when all of the volumes in Studies in the Scriptures were originally written. These were the views when over 90% of the Tower articles were published. Now, notwithstanding the published corrections, the 1916 volume forwards, remnants of these two views still appear in the volumes that we read today. For example, pages 99, 100, 101, 140, 141, 234, and 247 of our current volume 2 reads that the Gentile kingdoms would be totally eliminated by 1915. This which is still appears in the text in our volumes that we read today, this reflects the viewpoint that the true church would be glorified by 1912 and that the kingdoms of this world would be fully eliminated by 1915. Well, obviously, as we all know, 1914 did not result in the realization of these expectations, which leads us to our third view. The third phase of Bible student expectations is that the true church would not be glorified until an indefinite date, sometime after 1914. This view properly separated the completion of the Gentile times from the glorification of the entire church. This is a critical point. The small stone church smote the image on its feet in 1914, even though the church was not then complete, not then completely glorified. Reprint 5632, 5632, which was published on February 15, 1915. And here we quote, "But we see nothing here to conflict with the thought that the Lord's kingdom may be properly understood to have begun operations, and that the present smiting of the nations is under kingdom control. The fact that some of the members of the kingdom class are still in the flesh does not militate at all against this thought. We see the kingdoms of this world now being dashed to pieces, and we are expecting to see the process continue until they are completely ground to powder." End of quote. Disconnecting the completion of the church from the end of the Gentile times and the smiting of that Gentile image was a major change in Bible student thinking. For over 35 years, Bible students believed that the entire church had to be complete and had to be glorified in order for Christ's kingdom power to begin crushing, disintegrating, and evicting Satan's empire. But the third view, adopted by early 1915, constituted what we would classify as a sea change in that expectation. Up until 1915, it was not clear, it was not certain whether or not the fullness of the Gentiles occurred at the time of the end of the Gentile times. Remember, the fullness of the Gentiles and the Gentile times are two very different concepts. But the passage of 1914, without the feet members of the church being glorified, made it perfectly clear. The beginning of a global war smiting the European nations in 1914 made it even more clear. The church would not need to be complete in order for Christ's kingdom to begin displacing Satan's empire. Reprint 5632, again, that's 5632. "Now the time has come for God's kingdom to displace them," referring here to the Gentile kingdoms. "It is our judgment that we shall see more of this iron rule and its breaking influence, not only upon the nations, but upon society at large." There's one thing that we want to note here that comes up actually in quite a number of articles, and it is note carefully in this particular reference that what Christ's kingdom begins to do in October of 1914. It begins to displace the Gentile kingdoms. Not replace, but displace the Gentile kingdoms. Now, this third view of Bible students' expectations relative to the glorification of the church envisioned three progressive stages in the disintegration and the displacement of Satan's empire. Again, reprint 5632. We quote, "The present step is the war of the nations. The next step will be socialism and attempted socialism among the people. Then the third step, anarchy, will gradually come on." End of quote. Now, this three-step expectation was based on the wind, earthquake, and fire symbolism of 1 Kings chapter 19. And these three steps would constitute what we might characterize as the Lord's complete house cleaning operation of displacing Satan's administration. Now, while the Lord and his saints that he glorified in 1878 and afterward had begun this house cleaning in October 1914, the Lord was concurrently completing the development and the glorification of the remaining members of his body. Both works, that is to say, the displacing of Satan's kingdom and the completion of the body of Christ, were occurring at the same time. Christ beginning the process of displacing Satan's kingdom does not wait for the completion of the body of Christ. This is what we're referring to here, and we appreciate Brother Rick taking us through the chart, but this is what we're referring to here is the lapping of the dispensations. And it's also the lapping of the gospel and millennial ages that we see on that chart. The lapping of the dispensations means Satan's administration is outgoing and Christ's administration is incoming simultaneously, hence the lap or the lapping. Satan's administration is gradually waning and Christ's administration is gradually gaining at the same time. We're going to come back to that point a little later on. How about the lapping of the ages? Well, the lapping of the ages means two entirely different groups of people are being dealt with simultaneously. Christ is completing his body members at the very same time that he is exercising his influence to begin reshaping the world systemically, not individually. We're not dealing with individual heart work yet in the world of mankind. That we know comes later. That's during the mediatorial phase of the kingdom, which has not yet begun. Now, this third view of the time of the glorification of the entire body of Christ, which would be an indefinite date sometime after 1914, was officially incorporated into Studies in the Scriptures on March 1st, 1915. The reprint which announced these changes is 5649, 5649, published on March 1, 1915. This article announced and declared 13 specific wording changes to volumes 2 and 3 of Studies in the Scriptures. All 13 changes boil down to two basic points. First, the glorification of the church is independent from the end of the Gentile times. Secondly, the church glorification occurs after the end of the Gentile times, the completion of the glorification of the body of Christ. Now, 18 months later, after this 1915 article, which has put us into September of 1916, these two basic points, that is to say, the church is glorified independent from the end of the Gentile times, and the church glorification occurs sometime after the Gentile times end. These 2 points were confirmed in a late article. It was published in September 1916. It's reprint 5950. And there we quote, "We imagined that the harvest work of gathering the church would be accomplished before the end of the Gentile times. But nothing in the Bible said so. Our thought was purely an inference. And now we see that it was an unjustified one. This harvest work belongs to the new dispensation and cannot be identified with the old." End of quote. Now, we'd like to spend just a moment explaining what we think we're reading from the quote that we just offered. Our understanding of this quote is that the Gentile times is associated with the old dispensation. The Gentile times is really something associated with Satan's administration or Satan's empire. The Gentile times pertain to Satan's administration that began to be dispossessed or displaced in 1914. The completion of the gospel church is part of the new dispensation. The completion of the gospel church is part of Christ's administration, not Satan's. It's part of the incoming administration. The timing of the outgoing administration does not indicate the timing of the glorification of the church, which is part of the incoming administration. Thus, we can't use the timing of the end of the Gentile times to indicate the timing of the completion of the church. These are not connected events. They're related, but you can't connect the one to the other time-wise. The Bible does not disclose a date certain for the completion of the glorification of the church. The absence of such a date is reflected in the end of the life of Elijah, who pictures, we believe, the true church. Now, as we recall, in 2 Kings chapter 2, Elijah was directed to 4 different destinations, first to Gilgal, then to Bethel, then to Jericho, and finally to the Jordan, crossing the Jordan. Reprint 5772 identifies each of these 4 destinations with the respective dates of 1874, 1878, 1881, and finally 1914. After the 4th stop, which was the crossing of the Jordan, Elijah was directed not to stop, not to sit down, but to go on. But he was not directed to go to any other place. The absence of any further destination pictures, we believe, that there is no biblically disclosed date for the completion of the glorification of the church. Reprint 5772, and we quote, "Not disconcerted, Bible students are going on, even as Elijah and Elisha went on after crossing the Jordan. They are not, however, headed for any particular date, even as Elijah was not directed to go to any other place." End of quote. Now, this third view of an indefinite date for the glorification of the church and that Christ's kingdom would progress nevertheless was also reflected in studies in the scriptures in the October 1, 1916 forwards, which all of us have no doubt read many times, which of course the Central Ohio Brethren had an entire convention on these, I believe just a few years ago in 2016. This third view is the 1916 vision. This third view provides our framework for the 2020 vision, namely that the Bible does not disclose to us the date of the glorification of the final members of the Christ. And notwithstanding the incomplete body, Christ proceeds nevertheless to establish his administration and to displace Satan.
This is nice to take away to such an extent that...
Okay, Bible students' expectations for over 35 years that they would be glorified by 1915 was an enormous motivator on the brethren back then. You know, Bible student fervor up through 1914 was unparalleled in many ways. This fervor led to a staggering amount of truth and truth material being distributed globally through colporteurs, through the pilgrims, through the newspaper sermons, live sermons, tract distributions, the photodrama, the Eureka drama, and private witnessing in other ways. Among the other ways, the level of Bible student fervor for truth distribution activity and the fervor of the Bible student truth distribution machine, we might call it, can be oversimplistically, and we readily admit this is a characterization or a description that is overly simplified. But just to kind of give us a touchstone on the amount of fervor, we can measure and appreciate that by the amount of money that was spent in 1914 on truth distribution. We've changed these dollars to 2020 dollars, so they're in today's dollars that we're going to mention. In 2020 dollars, the Watchtower, as well as the Brethren, spent approximately $32 million in 1914 in truth distribution globally. Now, just as a quick comparison, the Watchtower spent about $7 million in 1913 in truth distribution. However, just as the anticipation of the full glorification in 1914 energized the brethren to an unparalleled degree that had been seen up to that time, the disappointment of not being glorified in 1914 had an impact on truth activity. Some of the impact was immediate, and some did not occur until later on. So again, if we oversimplify the matter by showing the impact in today's dollars, we see that in 1915, the money spent by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society on truth distribution dropped from about 32 million to about 7 million. In 1916, the money spent by the Watchtower on truth distribution further dropped to about 3.7 million. So in 3 years, in 1914, 1915, 1916, the financial contribution to truth distribution went from 32 million to 7 million to 3.7 million. Now, we don't want to be misunderstood here. The reduction in money spent after 1914 doesn't mean that the truth distribution work suddenly died in 1916. It didn't. Watchtower statistics compiled by Brother Ed Lorenz and given to me many years ago show considerable truth witness activity up through 1920. And that's as far as he went with his investigation. Hundreds of thousands of volumes were printed and distributed by hundreds of colporteurs through 1920. The number of pilgrims actually increased after 1914. Millions of tracts of literature were distributed. Hundreds of thousands of people attended thousands of public meetings, including the photodrama, Eureka drama, showing parlor meetings, and other things. Brethren remained motivated to share the truth, in part because they believed, they expected to be glorified shortly after 1916. However, even though that was an indefinite date they were left with, they were still expecting that it was going to happen shortly after 1916. However, October 31, 1916 brought two major changes to the Bible student community. First, the brethren were devastated by the abrupt loss of the faithful and wise servant's selfless, pastoral, and shepherd-like leadership. Second, the Bible student community almost immediately began to experience a very different kind of leadership, a self-centered leadership style. And with that change of leadership, the brethren would gradually begin to see major changes in the truth message and also in the spirit of that message. Now, we believe that it's important for us today to know what happened in 1916 in the Bible student community and what has happened in the century since then. It's equally important to see that what happened in 1916 and in the century following 1916 impacts us today. Knowing and heeding the lessons of the past century has much to do with making our call and election sure. It has much to do with strengthening us. It has much to do with teaching us maybe what we should avoid. Immediately after October 31, 1916, the brethren with an oppressive spirit assumed leadership of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. And we have to understand, friends, that back at that time, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society was sort of the poster child. It was really the embodiment of the Bible student community and had been for some 40 years. The brethren who were keenly aware of it did not support this leadership change, called it usurpation. The new leadership used intimidation, they used character assassination, even physical force to gain total control. The sheep who opposed the new leadership style were ineffective to stop such wolf-like tactics. With the new usurpatory leadership promptly came a different message with a very different spirit. Without authorization, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society leadership published the so-called Volume 7, The Finished Mystery, and they purported to present this and publish it as the posthumous work of Brother Russell. And you can read that today in the foreword to The Finished Mystery. This book, The Finished Mystery, which was published in the summer of 1917, was highly critical of the government. It was highly critical of the American churches. It was highly critical of American leaders. The message of this book was presented in a way that intentionally attracted persecution on the authors. The authors believed that they would die violent deaths at the hands of political and religious leaders in response to a Bible student message designed to very harshly condemn and provoke government and church practices. In other words, in part, this volume was designed to poke the bear. So the first major change in the post-1916 truth message was the harsh spirit in which it was presented. What soon followed were numerous doctrinal errors and departures from the long-established Bible student truths. The new Watchtower Society characterized itself as the channel, the only channel of truth and salvation. Everyone who was not a follower of the Watchtower Society was consigned to second death in Armageddon. Second death became the big hammer to control the Bible student community through fear rather than leadership through love. In 1920, the Tabernacle Shadows was corrupted through reinterpretation. In 1924, the Watchtower Bible Tract Society stopped publishing the studies in the scriptures. Note, it didn't happen right away. It wasn't until 1924 that the studies in the scriptures stopped being published. In 1927, character development was discarded, not only as unnecessary, but as indeed a work of Satan. The new Watchtower leadership changed times and seasons. All of a sudden now, 1933 became the end of the Gentile times, thus a new chronology. In 1934, restitution for all was denied. In that very same year, it was declared that the church was to be under, and was indeed under, the terms of the new covenant. In 1939, perhaps the crown jewel of the era is that the ransom was cast aside by teaching that Adam would not receive a resurrection. Now, these few examples, and there's many others, but these few examples of a crescendo, a small start and a crescendo of doctrinal change and a change in spirit are sufficient to establish the point. Through a change of leadership, the very same corporate entity that for decades faithfully promoted the truth in the Bible student community gradually, grossly polluted the truth and perverted its spirit under the banner of New Light. Now, it's important for us to know what was the reaction of the Bible student community to this new leadership. The Bible student community reacted in 4 different ways to the new Watchtower leadership, spirit, and message. First, some stayed with the new leadership, either because they supported it and were of a kin spirit, or they didn't know where else to go. So they stayed with it. Others severed ties completely, some immediately and others over time. Those who severed ties with the new Watchtower leadership chose to move forward in one of 2 additional ways. They either formed other Bible student organizations that held views contrary to the new Watchtower leadership, or they remained independent. I'm going to take a look at each of these 2 reactions. Now, these 2 additional reactions produced very different results which affect us in 2020, which is why we want to take a look at them. The ones who formed new Bible student organizations post-1916 resulted in what we might say or might characterize as sub-communities of Bible students. In 1918, the Pastoral Bible Institute was incorporated in New York by former Watchtower leaders who opposed the new leadership of the Watchtower. The PBI's purpose was to serve the brethren in several ways, including a pilgrim service, which was really a pastoral type of work. It also fed the brethren spiritual food through a magazine called the Bible Standard and Herald of Christ's Kingdom. Thus, the PBI started out serving the brethren in ways that were similar to what the brethren were used to up through 1916. So the PBI had a very noble beginning. In 1918, the Watchtower Bible Society, the former Watchtower Bible Society director, one of the directors, Paul Johnson, created a separate movement called the Epiphany. He published a magazine and also republished the 1917 edition of Studies in the Scriptures. Again, a very noble start. Brother Johnson's movement became eventually known as the Layman's Home Missionary Movement, which we just heard a little bit about during the fellowship period. In 1918, another group of brethren formed a sub-community called the Stand Fast Movement. Their stated purpose was to stand fast in support of pre-1917 truths and stand fast in opposition to the new Watchtower Society. In 1922, another movement or sub-community of brethren called the Elijah Voice Society was created. In 1930, a group of brethren wanted to re-energize the public witness work that they had done so faithfully up through 1916. These brethren formed a radio program. A magazine called Radio Echoes was used as follow-up witness material. The magazine was renamed The Dawn in the 1930s, which eventually evolved into the Dawn Bible Students Association. The Dawn's purpose was to be a publishing house that supplied brethren with truth material, particularly witness material. They also provided a pilgrim service to help develop new classes of brethren that had become scattered post-1916. There were many other movements and sub-communities formed after 1916, both in the United States and abroad. A few, and just a few of these that we've been made aware of, include ones like the Goshen Fellowship, the Angel of Jehovah Bible and Tract Society, the Berean Bible Institute, New Covenant Fellowship, the Christian Truth Institute, New Covenant Believers, and others. In many cases, these sub-communities of brethren were born out of a very noble motive and out of a very noble purpose. Some were clearly a protest against the new Watchtower leadership, and there was a protest in favor of the pre-1917 truths and behavior and spirit that they had been taught. But unfortunately, some of these, some sooner and some later, departed from many of those truths. Bible students, historians suggest that what happened to Christianity after the apostles died is similar to what happened to the Bible student community after 1916. In the days of the apostles and in the days of the seventh angel, the truth and its spirit were bright, they were shiny, they were wonderful. In the days following the apostles, following their deaths, and in the days immediately following 1916, a great falling away occurred. In both cases, a falling away eventuated in a strong, central, dominant figure in both instances. In the first instance, we have a pope that emerges. In the second instance, we have a very interesting and aggressive new president of the Watchtower Society. What followed in Christianity during the Reformation was a series of protests born out of a noble purpose. But regrettably, these early Protestants or reformers backslid into some of the same errors, or actually, formed new errors. After 1916, Bible student reformers, we might call them, initiated a series of Protestant movements against the new Watchtower leadership. But regrettably, many of these Bible students reformers, sooner or later, fell into error of some degree. Both instances bear the marks of the great adversary, whose desire we know is to thwart the truth. You know, the adversary's tactics worked quite well. They were very effective the first time around. So why not use the same tactics the second time around against the brethren? Now, we mentioned that there were two different ways that those who separated from the Watchtower Society reacted, and we've just talked about the one. The second way that some brethren responded to the new Watchtower leadership was not to create or join other organizations, or not to create sub-communities of Bible students. These were determined not to be sectarian. They were determined not to be followers of any of the servants of the Lord. Rather, they were determined to remain loyal to the Lord and to the truth already provided as of 1916. Now, some brethren, independent at heart, did associate with certain post-1916 Bible student organizations for a while, but as soon as they saw what they believed to be either sectarianism or error or both, they withdrew and they tried their best to remain separate. You know, we think it's interesting that if we look at 1 Corinthians chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, Paul counsels the brethren. He takes 4 chapters in 1 Corinthians to counsel the brethren to not give our loyalty to a man or to men, but to Christ only. The first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians is dedicated to a concept called sectarianism, and it's very contrary to the wholesome message and the whole message of Christianity. Volume 6, pages 81 through 83, underscores this counsel that Paul gave. So the brethren who were determined not to form or to become part of other Bible student communities post-1916 were determined to follow both Paul's counsel and also the counsel in Volume 6. Now, these brethren zealously and publicly served the Lord and the truth and the brethren in a variety of ways. Their works included republishing the works of the faithful and wise servant, rather than creating those of their own, including deviations of their own. They broadcast radio and TV truth programs. They translated truth materials into many different languages that it might be distributed and shared around the world. These brethren created and maintained global communication facilities. They maintained links to keep brethren connected. They did all this by maintaining what they wanted, what their heart desired as being a single-minded loyalty to the Lord. They refused to become disciples of men. However, these brethren who refused to create or associate with other post-1916 organizations were not spared. We don't want to be misunderstood here. These brethren were not exempted from the testing that would continue on. The loyalty of these brethren who remained independent has been severely tested in new and subtle ways. Some have reinterpreted pre-1917 truths that were so beautifully and harmoniously explained to us before 1917. Others have replaced these pre-1917 truths with their own ideas. Some have simply walked away. Some no longer assemble at all. You know, sometimes we ask ourselves why it is seemingly taking so long to complete the church class, especially when the expectation was that it would be completed in 1914, and at the very latest, it was still expected back at that time to be completed shortly after 1916. We ask ourselves, why is it taking so long? We believe that we have just seen one reason that it's taking so long. And that reason is that the Lord has permitted brethren to be attested along lines in the past century that are profoundly subtle. Psalms 91, verse 7. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 shall fall at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. Brethren are being severely tested yet to this day in refined ways, and the resulting siftings, we believe, will continue until the new creation is complete and glorified and beyond the veil. Now, thus far, we have emphasized the importance of remaining faithful to the truth principles that the Lord provided to us through that special messenger that were provided up through 1916. We've emphasized the importance of remaining faithful to the explanation that the Lord coordinated for us and gave to us through that servant. What is the reason that we emphasize this? Well, both Jehovah and Jesus tell us that they selected a special servant to compile and explain their principles, their message to each of us. Let's just take a look at just a few of these. In Ezekiel chapter 9, we find a reference to the man clothed in linen with the writer's inkhorn, a reference to a very special communicator of the Lord's truth, and may even suggest one who had an exceptional ability to communicate in the written word. Matthew 24 refers to the faithful and wise servant. Actually, the word is doulos. It's the faithful and wise slave who was given management of all of the returned Lord's goods. A slave is one who has no will of his own. Revelation chapter 1, verse 20 refers to 7 stars that Brother Rick mentioned, each one a spiritual heavenly light that Jesus gives to guide each stage of the church. Revelation chapter 3, verse 14 refers to the special angel or the special messenger to the church of Laodicea, the church that would be present during the time of the Lord's presence. Revelation 17 refers to a unique messenger who would identify the great whore and declare the Lord's judgment message upon that system. Revelation 18 refers to a special angel who issues a message to true Christians, come out of her. Revelation 19 refers to a humble messenger of the Lord's blessing who says, don't worship me, worship God. These references and others show that Jehovah and Jesus selected a special mouthpiece, a special guiding light for the seventh church. Because the Lord refers to such a special servant, we believe that we are justified in relying on his ministry. If we substitute God-approved truth principles as explained by that servant with our own, we indeed will suffer spiritually. Look at the past century and we can see some of the suffering, some of the outcome of that occurrence. Now, our emphasis on staying with the Lord's truth, as explained by the seventh angel, may raise a question in our minds. How should we utilize the ministry of the seventh angel and yet not become sectarian and therefore contrary to the counsel, the extensive counsel that the Apostle Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4? Well, friends, we're not here to tell you how you should use the ministry of that servant. We do, however, want to share with you how we use that ministry. Now, we're going to oversimplify this into just 2 points. Again, this is admittedly oversimplified. But we use that ministry to do principally two things. First of all, we use that ministry to identify the scriptures that build a topic, that build a system of truth. Friends, there's over 30,000 verses of scripture in the King James Bible. And I'm not sure about anyone else, but I can tell you, I need a lot of help just to figure out which ones I need to be, compiling. Which ones do I need to be bringing together to figure out how to get a balanced perspective on a particular topic? That's the first way that we use the ministry of the seventh angel, to identify the scriptures to build the topic. Secondly, we use that ministry to understand those scriptures, and not just understand the scriptures academically, but also to understand both the spirit of those scriptures as well as the application of those scriptures. We see our time is rapidly nearing to a close, so we want to conclude our thoughts of today on the completion of the new creation with a very sobering admonition. Jesus said in Matthew 24:24 that during the Sabbath day, during the day that Jesus would be present, the church would be severely tested by deception. They would be severely tested by false doctrine and false teachers. Jesus explains that false teachers would present doctrines purporting to be Christian, but not Christian, not truly Christian, not of the Lord's mind at all. Volume 4, page 581, suggests that these delusions, these deceptions, may be directed toward those, notice, directed toward those possessing the largest degree of present truth. That's where these delusions, deceptions would be directed and targeted. A study of the past 100 years of Bible student history has proven Jesus' prediction to be absolutely true. The post-1874 church continues to be subjected to deception and delusions, non-Christian doctrines appearing to be Christian. Satan knows that the completion of the church, we might ask ourselves, well, why the increased deception now? Why is the adversary doing that now? Well, Satan knows that the completion of the church means the prompt and complete and final collapse of his empire. So Satan, we believe, is putting forth his most strenuous efforts against the Lord's people, very targeted to deceive, to thwart the completion of the church. Deceiving the Lord's people is Satan's main weapon to try and protect what remains of his crumbling empire. Deception is a major reason that a century after the expectations of 1914, the church is still not complete. Apparently, many have fallen prey to Satan's masterful delusions, error that appears to be truth, darkness that appears to be light. The past 100 years of Bible student history should serve as a heads up, a stern warning, a wake-up call to every one of us, every one of the Lord's people. Be careful. We admonish all, including ourselves. We are not exempt from the tests we're talking about. We are just as able to succumb to them as anyone else. And so we do not stand here as some type of a judge, that we're judging someone else. We're judging ourselves and counseling ourselves as well. Be careful not to fall prey to Satan's delusions and sectarianism. Be careful to not fall prey to human teachings and human conduct and the spirit of the world. And how do we do that? The Apostle Paul, we believe, gives us a guideline, a principle guideline in 1 Corinthians 11:1, when he says, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." Brother Ed, over to you, please.